Hexactinellids, or glass sponges, are one of the 4 living classes of modern sponges, and they're easily recognised by their possession of a unique spicule type called the hexactin. The problem is that everyone has long assumed that if you have hexactins in a fossil sponge, that is also a hexactinellid. So today I want to persuade you, 1, that that's a mistake, and 2, that this has potentially major implications for our whole understanding of the origin and early evolution of animals. When we're interpreting fossils, we always have as our basis a comparison with living animals or plants or whatever it is. And this is inevitable, this is our starting point, it's how we know what we're looking at. But it's important to understand that as you trace evolution backwards, things don't just become simpler versions of the familiar. Evolution is complex, it's full of twists and turns and unexpected offshoots, and even things doubling back on each other. Everything that was successful enough to leave fossils behind is the end result of countless generations of its ancestors becoming more and more adapted to the conditions in which they lived. We use modern organisms for guidance, but we should not expect that when we trace their story backwards, the result should be simple. So, hexactinellids. Beautiful, ethereal animals of the deep sea, ancient, long-lived, and mysterious, because most people will never get to see one of these alive. Sadly, I haven't. They have a superb fossil record from the Cretaceous period, alongside the last dinosaurs that weren't birds. And this record also shows that what we have today is a remnant of their former glory. Many of the living lineages of hexactinellid sponges are found in these Cretaceous rocks, but also there are numerous groups of fossil hexactinellids that we don't see today. It looks as though they have been declining for a long, long time. How do we recognise them as fossils? Well, it's through their skeleton. Like most sponges, they have a skeleton of thousands of little needles of, in this case, opal, which are woven together to make a coherent structure. But hexactinellids have a unique spicule type, what is called the hexactin. Here's one I made earlier. 6 rays, hence hexactin, all at 90 degrees to each other, so like basically a 3-dimensional cross. And there are lots of variations on this spicule type as well, so there are also pentactins. There you go, one missing. Storactins. Even tauactins. And in fact, many diactins. Yeah, going to run out of ideas soon, but you get the idea. It is always with the spicule rays at about 90 degrees, which is unique among modern sponges. So in demosponges and in calcareans you can have tetractins, which, give me half a second, look like that. A caltrops. So these are totally different ray angles, 4 rays, but nothing like a storactin where you have the 4 in one plane. So it is immediately recognisable, they're distinctive, and you see one of these in any modern, one of the previous ones, in any modern sponge, and you know you've got a hexactinellid. The spicules of hexactinellids can also be quite large, which makes fossilisation much easier. And they also are arranged in quite a complex way, and modern hexactinellids, with almost no exceptions, have a very complex architecture to the body wall with internal cavities and chambers and canals. This, for example, is the hypodermal layer, which underlies the skin of this sort of, well, I say skin, underlies the outer surface of this hexactinellid, and you can see there's multiple different types of spicule arranged, including these tiny little Christmas tree-like things coating the surfaces. Those are the dermal spicules. And this is just the outer part. So if we were to be able to see inside this, there would be another layer of spicules deep underneath there, which has a different structure again. So we know what hexactinellids look like, and we can recognise them quite easily in the fossil record. As a result of all this, the traditional view on the fossils has been very straightforward. If it has hexactins, or their derivatives like pentactins, it's a hexactinellid. If it's a very simple structure with hexactins, then it's a stem group hexactinellid. This has also been supported by some modern biological work looking at secretion mechanisms, which seems to suggest that they have different mechanisms in different classes of sponges, and therefore they independently evolved their skeletons. There are various reasons why that is not by any means a watertight argument, which I'll come on to in another video, but I'm also working into a paper I'm doing at the moment. But today I just want to focus on this one fundamental assumption that is built into our knowledge of sponge evolution. I do need to put out a little warning here, in that I am going to be reporting a lot of my own work, because I'm one of the main people who is actually researching this area and coming up with these anomalies that need explaining. So yes, I'm not entirely unbiased, but then nobody is. You could get someone who is completely biased the other way. However, I do think that the evidence basically speaks for itself. So, onto a rogues gallery of interesting sponges with hexactins. This first one is Ephelia globosa from the Burgess Shale, and it was my first significant paper, I guess, working with Nick Butterfield. And this is a sponge that had been traditionally classified as a calcarea, one of the class Calcarea. So the reason for this is that it is a simple thin-walled version of something that you get very commonly with much thicker walls later on in the Paleozoic, in the Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, and is characterized by 6 rayed spicules in one plane, these hexaradiate spicules. And these ones have also been shown in sponges preserved in limestone, later species this is, to be composed of calcite. So they are calcareous or calcite spicules with a symmetry form that is similar to the threefold symmetry, the triradiate symmetry of modern calcareans. So this has long been assumed to be a calcarean sponge, and a stem group example of them. However, close examination of even the type material, I went back to the original specimens that have been described, show that they are actually not only full of these hexaradiate spicules, but also hexactins, which of course are diagnostic of hexactinellids. So this puts it in an awkward position, because it's very difficult to accommodate a sponge that has features diagnostic of both of these two classes, unless one of them is evolved convergently and it doesn't actually mean anything. Next up is one from the Herefordshire Lagerstätte of England. This is Silurian deposit. Extraordinary fossils preserved as three-dimensional, soft-bodied, and in this case mineralized as well, animals in nodules in a volcanic ash bed. It's a really weird, unique fauna, but incredible things come out of it. And here we're looking at a thing called Cardiuispongia. It's got a square grid of spicules, it's got these long spines sticking out, which are the extended rays of hexactins, and it looks very similar to various Ordovician and Silurian, what we call reticulosans, so things that have previously been called stem group hexactinellids. And it's absolutely fine. It's got the regular grid, it's got hexactins all over the place, it's got the right body form. The only problem is, or one of two problems, is that this thing was made of calcite. These spicules were originally calcite, as has been shown by comparison with other things that were originally silica in the same deposit, so radiolarians. Anything silicious is preserved as anchorite, a different mineral. Anything originally calcareous is preserved as calcite. Unlike all the other sponges in the deposit, this one had calcite spicules. Okay, that's weird enough, but then we can zoom in on the soft part of the structure. So in cross-section, you can actually see remnants of the soft tissue organisation, the architecture of the body between the spicules that is supported by the rays of these spicules. And we can even see these little tiny chambers, which is where the filter feeding is done. And this architecture, this arrangement of almost little bubbles like in a foam, is what we call a ciliabid structure. And today that architecture is known only in a group of calcareans, not in hexactinellids. So, like in Ephelia, we have something with calcarean-like features, very calcarean-like, but has hexactins. In this case, it's different features. We have a different type of spicule. This one looks entirely like hexactinellid in its spicule architecture. What we have instead is the mineralogy of the spicules is definitely calcitic, and it has soft tissue of a calcarean. So this is not just the same possible secondary derivation of hexactins that we saw in Ephelia being extended to this one. It must be either the entire branch of calcarea originally had hexactins, or this is a third derivation of hexactins in calcarea. One thing that's quite striking, though, is that if it wasn't for this preservation, we wouldn't know what the original mineralogy was, and we certainly wouldn't know about the soft tissue. And if we just saw the skeleton, that would have been described as a hexactinellid. There are many, many sponges which have a very similar sort of architecture from the Ordovician and Silurian, which we have always assumed are at least related to hexactinellids. This suggests we can't take anything for granted. Okay, let's go even weirder. This next one is one that we call Heteractinigma, and the name tells you everything you need to know. The basic structure of this really tall, thin sponge with these longitudinal spicules running down it, and a little, quite a wide opening at the top, is very similar to what we call leptomytids. It's a family of Cambrian sponges which are problematic in their origin. I've recently created a new class, the Ascospongii, to incorporate those and other things, but the leptomytids just have monaxon spicules, just simple needle-like things running lengthways up the sponge, and then also transverse little bundles of them, much finer ones all the way up. So this is actually from the Ordovician, it's from the Liujiao section in China, and it looks at first glance like a leptomytid, but it was preserved with remarkable levels of detail, and when you zoom in, you find a whole array of other spicules. These spicules include things that we do not normally see in any sponges whatsoever. So you have triradiates, yes. You also have pentaradiates, 5 rays in one plane. There is one aberrant modern calcarean that does that, a thing called Cycon pentactinoides, I think it is. And then there are also large areas with lots and lots of tiny hexactins. We don't honestly know where Heteractinigma fits in the sponge phylogenetic tree. The Ascospongii in general, whatever they are quite possibly a sister to all of the other sponges, so they are stem group Porifera. On the other hand, we don't know for certain. They could be an early branch off one of the other lineages within the crown group of Porifera. But in any case, it's not closely related to either of the two cases we've seen so far. This is another example with hexactins in a place that is clearly not hexactinellid. And it's not alone among ascosponges either, because there are other relatively primitive forms of these, or so we think, which have very simple skeletons, and they also have large numbers of tiny hexactins, often very short, stubby-rayed things embedded in the skeleton before, in general, they were lost. However, they also appear in Koyaella, which is a relatively simple member of the other main branch of this group, the Ascospongii. And this suggests that the hexactins are actually a primitive character for the Ascospongii as a whole. The next one is from the Angibiota. This is an incredible latest Ordovician, right at the very end, fauna from deep water mudstones of China. And it includes a huge diversity of sponges, most of which are not yet described, although I've written up about 100 on the way to a monograph. I'll do a video about that at some point. But one of the first ones we did describe we called Consiliosponge angiensis. because it shows characters of two different classes of sponges. The basic skeleton is a sort of tufted meshwork, felted meshwork of minute little monaxon spicules. And this is absolutely typical of the early demosponges. Things like Hexalia and Chromulospongia from the Burgess Shale show exactly this type of architecture. And with this sort of porous structure as well, it's absolutely fine for an early demosponge. It's exactly what you'd expect, and no other sponges have a skeleton quite like that. The only problem is that it contains hexactins. Not a huge number, they're isolated, they're embedded within these sort of tracts of, or tufts of monaxons, but they are there. And this is not something that you should find in a demosponge. I should also say that we're currently working on a follow-up paper, having found another specimen of this and being able to get it into the electron microscope. So there is more to come, and yes, it is definitely a demosponge. Is it getting silly enough yet? We now have sponges that are assigned to every major class, excluding the Homoscleromorpha, about which we know virtually nothing about their origins, including the extinct ascosponges, that have hexactins. So this is starting to look like a bit of a pattern, isn't it? And we don't even have to stop with Consiliosponge when it comes to demosponges, because there's another weird bit of information on something that has been called a hexactinellid in the past. Cythoficus roydeli is probably the most abundant sponge in the area where I live, and it's also a classic early hexactinellid, as it has been described. It has a regular square grid of little hexactins, and around here we're very lucky in that we also have a site which preserves a bit more detail than normal. This is the Llanfair Lagerstätte, and the sponges here are preserved in much the same way, but they have remarkable fine detail of the spicule skeleton, but also of some of the soft tissues. What we're interested in today is the fine detail of the spicules themselves, because if you put these into electron microscopes, you can see the detail of the axial canals in the spicules. This is actually critical, because these canals have a symmetry to them. It is the shape of an organic filament which acts as a template that the spicules are secreted onto. And the shape of these filaments is dependent on the particular proteins that are involved in secreting them, whether they're silicatins or hexaxilins, for example. And because of this dependence on the original composition of the organic material, it is a different symmetry between hexactinellids and demosponges. So all hexactinellids have square canals in cross-section, square axial filaments. Demosponges, on the other hand, have triangular or hexagonal axial filaments. What we see here appears to be a pretty clear-cut case of hexagonal axial canals. They are most definitely not square. So we have demosponge diagnostic spicule structure, or axial canal filament, within a hexactin. That's a little bit weird, but the structure of the spicules themselves is also weird in other ways. There are multiple different layers of silica with organic material between them, here replaced by these coarse crystals. And in some cases, the entire centre of the spicule isn't there. It looks like it was a mass of just organic material instead of actually being mineralized. Interestingly, you do see a similar pattern to this in some modern homoscleromorphs. It's the only modern group that does that sort of multi-layered spicule with lots of thick organic deposits. But it has also been described by Tang et al. In a very early Cambrian, well, what they call a hexactinellid, a stem group hexactinellid. It has hexactins, it has these structures, but I'm starting to get to the point where I really don't know what that thing is. There are loads of examples of hexactins turning up in places you wouldn't expect them to be. But I also want to just highlight a couple at the end now, which are things that people have always called hexactinellids, or at least reticulosans, so related to hexactinellids, maybe stem group, but which on closer inspection have some very problematic features. So first of all, we have photospongia, also known as Diagonella. They are probably the same thing, but turned round. It's difficult when you've only got fragments of them, but photospongia we'll call it. And this one has a very regular, square grid, subdivided spaces by smaller and smaller spicules, what we call a quadruling pattern. It's very widespread among early sponges in general, but even Ephelia has the same pattern. But in this case, it's always been assumed that this was the archetypal, almost ancestral hexactinellid. The problem is, it doesn't seem to have been made of silica. There's only so far an abstract published by Alex Page and colleagues from quite a long time ago now, which states that they have direct evidence that this thing was originally calcitic. There are certainly some other papers that have shown interesting internal structures in some spicules. So at the moment we're basing this mostly on an abstract, but it is quite possible that a fuller version of some work of this type will happen at some point. I'll finish with a novelty. This is Metaxispongia. It's from the early Cambrian of China, and this and various of its relatives that are yet to be described have a skeleton made of hexactins or their derivatives, so things like strangest or pentactins. But there is very clear tetraradial symmetry. It's not alone in this. There is tetraradial symmetry in quite a few of these very early sponges. But this is not something you expect to find in hexactinellids. We don't know what the spicules are made of. It's always replaced by iron oxides. But this is something that it's very hard to squeeze into hexactinellids, given that there is no tetraradial symmetry in any of the living groups of sponges today. That isn't all of what's out there, but that should give you a pretty good feel for the sheer diversity of places in the sponge fossil record where you find hexactins and you wouldn't necessarily expect to. So how do we interpret this lot? There are actually several ways of doing it, at least three. The first one, we can say, right, let's stick to the assumption hexactins are still the diagnostic feature of hexactinellida. That means that all of these sponges I've shown you are actually all hexactinellids. All of the features that make them look like entirely different groups of sponges are in fact convergently evolved. So Ephelia has evolved hexaradiate spicules convergently with Astraeospongeids, these other stem group calcareans, and so on. Everything that we see that doesn't match up with hexactinellid, but does match with another group, has to be convergently evolved with that group. It means that there are huge numbers of rampant bits of convergent evolution recreating the same details of sponges in different lineages. But it is theoretically possible, and I have actually had people argue this to me, that this is the explanation, that just hexactinellids were far more diverse than we give them credit for, far more diverse than they are today. But it just makes no sense to me to have all these levels of convergence in spicule mineralogy, spicule form, architecture, soft tissue arrangement. All these factors would have to be convergent for this to be right, so that we can save this one secret character of hexactins being unique to hexactinellida. Personally, I don't like that option. The second option is the one that I've been arguing for quite a few years now, which is that hexactins evolved once, quite early on in sponge evolution, before the crown group, and they have been lost in a few lineages. It requires loss within the demosponges, where the skeleton was basically taken over by these tiny little monaxons and the organic skeleton, fibre skeleton, which then is far more flexible in terms of creating all sorts of structures. So that makes sense. It would also have been lost once in the calcareans, plus or minus the homoscleromorphs wherever they fit in. But the calcareans, with their calcite spicules, have a natural affinity for triradiate spicules because the crystal symmetry of calcite matches the symmetry of the spicules. So there are energetic benefits for being able to secrete easily within a certain shape, and right angles don't really fit in that pattern. So you can also see why there was this shift away from the hexactins to the hexaradiates and then triradiates in calcarea. I don't have a problem there either. The asker sponges would be the last stage where they are lost, and that is also entirely plausible because, again, the skeleton became dominated by, instead of these tiny little hexactins and other weird things like pentaradiates, it became dominated by long, very robust monaxons that then defined the structure of the sponge and were adapted in all sorts of ways afterwards. In many cases with a very thick organic outer layer as well, so they became quite complex structures. But again, I don't see there's any difficulty with losing hexactins there. And the huge benefit, of course, with this is that it means that all those other convergences in things like the soft tissue organisation just disappear. They're not convergence, it's just part of an evolving spectrum of sponge morphology, which started out with a skeleton that included hexactins and was then modified in these different groups to... What? What?
Some of these hexactins are calcite and some are silica. How do you explain that?
There's always one, isn't there? Right, well, I will refer you to a future video where I'll be discussing that some of these spicules have another peculiarity, particularly the Cambrian, where there is clear evidence that they are not just silica, or indeed just calcite, that there are two mineral phases in the same spicule. So we have clear evidence for this in some. Mostly it's less easily preserved because calcite and silica have different types of preference for how they actually fossilise, the chemical conditions. But we do also know that even in modern hexactinellids, there is one called Caulophacus, which actually secretes calcite as well as silica within the spicule. So it's not an insurmountable problem. We just have to stop thinking of these as purely fixed. When you go back far enough, it becomes a bit of a more malleable spectrum of structures in which calcite and silica and organic material were all involved in the construction of the spicules. That's what I say anyway. What? Anyone see what she went? Or did I imagine that? The third option that I can come up with is that indeed all of these occurrences of hexactins in odd places are independent origins of hexactins. They evolved multiple times across the sponge evolutionary tree. But this doesn't solve anything for us. It just means that unless every branch that evolved hexactins just went extinct, we have, as well as the losses that we've talked about just now, required by ancestral hexactins, you also have all of these parallel gains. And so in terms of likelihood, it really isn't an improvement. So my preferred interpretation of all this, obviously, is that the fossil record is actually giving us information. It's not just a whole pile of red herrings. And this is at least something which is also provable or testable, in that if everything is connected by these hexactin-bearing ancestors, then the more new discoveries we find in Cambrian, Ordovician, possibly even Ediacaran rocks, the more they should tie together and form a more coherent framework. They may well be oddities as well that turn up, odd little branches that we can't really place very easily but are also spiculate sponges. But the overall pattern should be that it becomes more and more integrated as we fill in more gaps. If, on the other hand, these are all convergent evolution, that shouldn't happen. We should expect to see the origins of each group becoming no more tractable than they are now. And in fact, you should not get close similarity between different branches in early sponge evolution that potentially ties them together. So it is entirely testable by some old-fashioned stuff like going out and finding more fossils. Okay, why am I putting so much thought and effort into this, you might be wondering? Does it actually make any difference in the grand scheme of things? Yeah, of course it kind of does. Because spicule skeletons can fossilise very easily. They did it all the way from the Cambrian up to the modern. And sponges are meant to be either the first or the second earliest branching groups of animals. And they have, theoretically, according to the predictions of molecular clock models, a very deep Precambrian history going back maybe to 600 million years, so more than 50 million years before the start of the Cambrian. And yet, we don't find any sponges with spicular skeletons in the Ediacaran. At a time when there was high silica levels in the sea, so any silicious skeletons should have been more easily preserved than they are in the Cambrian. This is potentially a bit of a problem. There have been some strange Ediacaran fossils that have been interpreted as sponges, but most of the older ones have been debunked and some of the newer ones haven't been yet, shall we say. But there's nothing there that looks like a Cambrian sponge. So there's obviously, even if some of these Ediacaran things do turn out to be sponges, we have got a big problem if the spicule skeletons are shared between the different groups, because those skeletons should, according to the molecular clocks, go back a long way into the Precambrian, and we do not see them. We even have geochemical evidence for the onset of large-scale biosilicification at the time that we start seeing spicules around the base of the Cambrian. It all fits together perfectly neatly for sponges originating and diversifying just before the base of the Cambrian. This does not match our current views of the Ediacaran, because we have various other things. Well, there are huge numbers of very strange fossils, of course, in the Ediacaran biota, a few of which are convincingly Cnidarian-like. But if we can be confident that sponges should be there and aren't, and they have a better fossilization potential than any of these other organisms, we need to reassess some of our options. So one possibility, which I keep coming back to actually, is that what we recognise as sponges, the entire sponge body plan, is a derived character. That they have a long history on the branch leading to sponges from something that was not like a sponge at all. And therefore we only see things that look like actual sponges around the very, very end of the Precambrian or into the Cambrian, because before that their ancestors were nothing like sponges. It's a possibility, and that is something that is certainly worth bearing in mind as an option. Another possibility is that we are seeing evidence here that the Cambrian explosion, or the diversification of the major clades of animals, really was a very brief event. And a lot of these organisms in the Ediacaran biota, where the evidence is not 100% watertight as to what they are, shall we say, could be reinterpreted. If they are instead stem group animals, things leading up to the branch with sponges and other organisms, sponges and other animals rather, then that might also be a solution to this problem. But it does lead to other problems in itself. In either case, we have issues that remain unsolved. If sponges evolved from something that was not like a sponge at all, then that has implications for our understanding of the last common ancestor of all animals. If the Cambrian explosion was much more rapid than the current sort of view is tending to interpret it as, then that also leads to all sorts of unanswered questions. Either way, there's a bit of a conflict here. We shouldn't be afraid of conflicts in the fossil record or between them and molecular clocks, because this is where science really thrives. It's where you have discordances between different ways of looking at things. that something has to give, and that's where we make steps forward. That's where we really have to resolve it by chucking out some of the old ideas and then rebuilding in a form that works better. Well, I'll leave it there for now. I have an introduction to sponges if you suddenly feel like you need one, and I also have a video on Chancelloreids, which are a very enigmatic group that can be interpreted as pointing in a similar sort of direction to what I've just been talking about. I'll be diving deeper into various parts of sponge history in future videos, so please do subscribe and stick around if that's of interest to you, and as well as doing all sorts of other things about the fossil record and natural history and how we interpret both of them. So thank you very much for all of the appreciation this channel is getting so far, because I'm already getting a reasonable following. It's actually really rather nice, and it's lovely to see so many comments and interactions going on. So thank you all again, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.